Hey everyone, before we start this week's episode, do us a quick favour. If you're enjoying listening to the podcast, if you're getting something from it, please leave us a little review. Maybe that's on Apple Podcasts or somewhere else that you're getting you're listening to your podcasts. We'd really appreciate it. It's going to help us grow the podcast. And if you want to share it with someone else who might, want to listen to it, please get the word out there. We're seeing the numbers going up, and we love what we're doing here. So help us out, share it. Really appreciate it. Thanks a lot, guys. Now then, everyone, this is the Wedding Mavericks podcast, a podcast for wedding photographers and videographers who want to build successful and sustainable businesses. My name is Jules. It's just me again this week. Yeah, it's hard doing them together, me and Lindsay at the moment. And this week's episode, we're going to be discussing audio recording for wedding filmmaking. Now, before you start yawning and turning off and all the rest of it, or maybe you didn't even download this one because you didn't think it was going to be relevant, believe me, it's proper important. So, let's, kind of put some context on the audio stuff. It's not going to be for everyone, I get it. It's more aimed at wedding videographers, filmmakers. But, let's say you are a wedding photographer and you're thinking, well, this doesn't really apply to me. Think about it. Everything is going towards video, right? If you haven't already started dabbling in, video in some way, shape or form, whether it be recording little reels on your social media, or maybe you're getting into it in commercial stuff, maybe you've started dabbling with wedding videography, wedding filmmaking as well. Even if you haven't done that yet, it's quite likely at some point you might want to. And even if you've got no intention of ever, getting involved in wedding filmmaking and videography side of stuff, as a photographer, you're going to be working alongside videographers quite regularly at weddings. So I would say that it's a good thing to have an understanding and an appreciation for why videographers might do things a certain way and what they're actually trying to do and what their processes are, what their challenges are at weddings, what they're intending to do. So because the audio side is one of those things that, if I'm being honest, the audio side, I would say, makes wedding videography as hard as it is. If you just had to point a camera and record little video clips, it wouldn't, it'd have the same level of difficulty, if you like, as photography, and potentially less difficulty in some respects. But as soon as you start adding like the long form video stuff into it, so having to think about how you're always going to have an angle to cut to, and you're thinking about how you're going to have continuous good quality audio of something, or you're going to try and incorporate audio into a creative film. When you get to that bit, that's what makes videography, in my experience, and bearing in mind we do both, that's what makes videography the more challenging medium, if you like. And that's not taking anything away from photographers or photography. That's just saying that on a wedding day, in particular, the audio side is quite a challenge because you can't control things in the way that you could in a film set or a studio environment. So yeah. I just wanted to, kind of put that out there straight away because I didn't want photographers just thinking, oh, fuck this in for me. When it is, it's very relevant, I would say. So another preface is that we're not audio experts. I'm not an audio expert. My background isn't in audio engineering, and it's not in music professionally either. So I don't have a professional academic background or anything in this. But audio is an integral part of our job. And so we've had to learn the basics. And because I'm really interested in it personally, I've always been into music and stuff like that. And half of my family are musicians or or have some background in the music industry. So I've got an interest and an idea about how audio and stuff works. So I've got an intermediate. I've taught myself, and I've got an intermediate understanding of recording audio, mixing it, manipulating it, and using it in different ways, but in particular wedding films, and that's what we're talking about today. So yeah, I'm not an expert. I don't know everything. I'm just going to give you my kind of knowledge. I'm going to share my knowledge and understanding of it. Hopefully on a wedding filmmaking level, that's going to be really helpful for people, particularly if audio isn't your strong point. Because I'm sure that there are plenty of people who know more about it and are better at it than me. But if you feel like it's a weak point, this podcast is going to be gold dust, because you're going to all this stuff. On a lot of these podcasts we talk about this, but on this particular podcast, the stuff I'm going to be talking about is definitely one of those episodes where it's like, I wish someone had explained it to me or given me this information in like simple terms back when I was starting out, or even when I was a couple of years in and still didn't really know what I was doing. So let's go to the next bit, which is we aren't going to be discussing music, using music in wedding films. And we're not going to be discussing the issues around licensing and using music that you record at a wedding. For instance, like a DJ's music, a performer at a wedding, musicians and stuff, or like the hymns in the church. We're not covering that. That's a topic for another time. It's a very complex and sometimes can create tension between people because people have different viewpoints on this, and it does involve law and things like that. So we're just going to be discussing the practicalities of capturing audio live and capturing and the reasons for capturing that audio. That's what we're going to be discussing in the podcast. So first of all, why are we capturing audio and not just the visuals? Like, why not just have, a silent film, or why not just use music? Why capture audio live at weddings? And, to some people that might be quite obvious, and to some of you, actually, that might be a very good question, because you might have focused on capturing more highlighted type films, which all you're ever going to do is mute all the sound, and you're going to put a music track over the top of it. And just so you understand where I sit on that, I'm not against that. Like, in some situations, that is actually the best thing to do. And some couples, that is what they're looking for. So I'm not saying that there is an issue with that. There's nothing wrong with it. But you're probably limiting yourself to, what you can do. There's so much more you can do if you record sound, and you can use that sound in different ways. And that's why it's really important. And when you're actually thinking about telling stories and making films that, are going to be a little bit more engaging than a music style video, audio is so important. So if you think about it in simple terms of like audio, sound, music is like 50% of a film. So 50% visuals, 50% what you hear. And the reason for that is, think about watching a film, any film. It could be a film that you've made, a wedding film, or it could be like, your favorite Hollywood film, or a, independent film, whatever. Try turning the sound off completely and watch that film, right? And notice how much of the feeling and the emotion is missing. So that gives you if you did that as an exercise, that would give you, a real understanding of just how powerful audio is to visuals, to filmmaking. So, if you're wanting to really tell story, get emotion, have that connection for the audience with what they're watching, the sound, the audio is key to everything you're doing. You could be amazing at filming, you could be amazing at capturing visual images, but if you don't do anything with the sound, you're never going to take it to that next level. You're never really going to give, the audience what they want and need. And in our world, the audience is your couple. So if you really want the couple to feel like what it was like at their wedding, capturing the sound at their wedding is going to be very important. So, I mean, in filmmaking, in proper filmmaking, the term we use for capturing the audio, using the audio, inserting audio, creating a sound to that visual is called sound design. And there's a whole department. It's a role for multiple people. But just like everything else with wedding filmmaking, it's all on us. So this has got to be part of our job. So we have to kind of learn this if we want to take things to the next level, if we want to push things forward. So how are we going to do that? The first place that we're going to start is, what will we reuse the audio for? So let's think about why we capture audio, what audio we capture and why we're capturing it. So let's talk about the different categories of things we might capture. So the first one, dialogue. So this is going to be people speaking, people having a talking through something. So it could be like a conversation, it could be delivering a speech, it could be vows, it could be a reading, those sorts of things. Think about the dialogue. We're going to want to capture that. And that's the most obvious thing, because everybody now tries to incorporate part of speeches or vows or a reading into their wedding film if they're trying to make a storytelling, inverted commas, cinematic wedding film. They try to incorporate some kind of vows or speeches in there. And they might be completely random vows and speeches. That's why I'm doing the inverted commas thing. Because they don't always necessarily make sense or fit. But obviously, that's what everybody's seeing. Everyone's seeing that we're putting those things in there. So we're trying to find something to put in there to make it a cinematic wedding film. So dialogue's the most obvious one. And that's why we're going to be looking for those people that are speaking at weddings, and we're going to be trying to capture the things that they're saying, the important things that they're saying. Obviously, there's lots of conversations we don't want to hear, but the things that people say that are important, we're wanting to capture those well. The next thing would be sound effects. So imagine, like, sound effects are things like to enhance the specific visuals. So if you've got somebody walking, that might be some footsteps that's going to enhance the visual. If there's water running, it's going to be the sound of water. If there's wind, if it's windy, you can see the trees are blowing, it's going to be the sound of wind. They're very, very generic, basic sound effects. But if you actually think about everything you look at in your scene, as you're looking at that frame, what could be making a sound in there? And if it could be making a sound, then there's an argument for the fact that you should be able to hear it. That doesn't mean you should hear everything that's happening in a frame. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm getting at is that we use sound effects to enhance the visuals by, showing a sound that's in the visuals. The next thing would be background. So, imagine, again, this kind of ties in with sound effects, but background could be more to do with, like, if there are people talking in the background, then we might want to have a very faint, murmur of a set of people talking. And that's just going to make it feel more believable, and it's not necessarily going to engage the viewer as such, but it's going to make it feel right. It's going to make it feel more believable. It's not about enhancing it as such. It's about balancing it. And we might, a crowd talking, a group of people talking is a very simple example, but there are lots of things that could be background noise. And there are background noises that we want, and there are background noises that we don't want. And I'm sure we've all been there where the baby the kids screaming in the background and it's ruining your audio. And so we've got to know how to recognize and work with those situations also. So that would be kind of your background audio. And then you've got your music. So this is usually going to be something that you add, but it could be recorded live. And there are two ways of incorporating music in there. One would be as an ambient kind of underscore. So it's just there in a very passive capacity to kind of add something to the film, but it's not really part of the storytelling. It's there to kind of enhance the emotion, but it's not there to push the story along. And then you would have music where it would be like vocal led, or it could be just a very powerful instrumental, but that would basically be a more leading piece of music, and that would be really pushing your story along, really creating drama and mood. So it could be, could be uplifting, it could be somber, depending what the situation is, what the emotion that you're trying to portray is, how you would kind of lead with that music to tell that story. Sometimes it could be with the lyrics if you use vocal tracks, and it's become very unpopular, I think, in a lot of the really good wedding filmmakers. It's become unpopular to use vocals, but me personally, I like to use vocals because I think it's important. I think that you can do a lot with songs that have vocals, because they can become your narration in a way, and some people might find it cheesy, but let's be honest, this is a wedding, this is a love story, this is two people who are in love. So actually some are not too cheesy, but if you can find something that makes sense, that's kind of where it needs to be. I'm sorry, my phone's just ringing and I can't turn it off. So that would be your music stuff. And then the last thing to mention, it would be Foley, and this is basically sound effects. So Foley is something that's used in films where they don't record the sound effects at the time of filming, but they add them in afterwards. So I guess this kind of ties together with sound effects, which are going to enhance things, but we're going to, rather than record those live at the time, we're going to find those sound effects from somewhere, whatever like library bank of sound effects that you've got access to. There are some built into your editing software, and there are places you can download them and buy them from. And those sound effects are basically going to replace noise that might not be ideal from the day, but they're going to match up with the footage, and they're going to help you to enhance the visuals and tell the story that way. Right, well, we're now on to what do we want to record at a wedding. So we talked about, the background noise. So we'll start with general ambient stuff. So you might hear this described as scratch audio that's like kind of recorded, just, we're not specifically trying to record the audio in a way, we're just kind of recording what's happening. And the best way I've found to do that, and we will come on to this in a bit more detail later in the episode, but is just to use the camera's own microphones and just record. Always have the levels at a place where you can just record whatever's happening. So if you press record, you're getting that audio, and you might find that it's really good for something at some point. A great, if people start like cheering, clapping, like yeah, like the someone like kind of the lads are all messing around or whatever, and someone does something and everyone goes yeah, and you're seeing that on there, you're probably going to want to bring the audio into that to help provide the context and make it feel right. So if you're always recording that general ambient noise, that's going to be really useful. And then the other thing we're going to want to do is be always anticipating the sounds that are going to happen, the audio that's going to happen, and what good points there might be for audio to record. So we're kind of, as well as thinking about the obvious stuff, we're also thinking about, when there might be audio that we can use. So it could be, moments where mum and daughter are just having a little talk. And again, you might not want to include it because it might be private, but it's always worth, if you're filming something, to have, to be thinking about that audio might actually be becoming useful. So I think what I'm trying to get at is you should always be thinking about recording the audio, even if you're thinking, well, there's not really any reason to. I'm never going to use this in a million years. So then we kind of move on to more important parts of the day and how we're going to kind of handle that audio. And if we think about stuff outside of the formal parts, things like letters, readings, gifts, first looks, these things we're definitely going to want to think about the audio. We're going to think about definitely having the in-camera audio on there, but how can we make that better? How can we capture the audio in a better way for things like letters and readings, gifts, first looks? Because they're probably times where things will be said that will potentially be great audio bites for putting your film together. So we're going to be preempting that. And that starts with the prep side of things. That starts prior to the wedding, having conversations. Are you exchanging letters? Are you exchanging gifts? Is anyone doing readings at this part of the day or that part of the day? Are you doing a first look? And then you can make sure that you've got the appropriate recorder, microphone, whatever, in place to record the sounds that you're going to hear at that point. And then the really most obvious parts are the ceremony speeches, first dance, and then other forms of entertainment. For instance, you might want to hear what a magician's saying if you're doing a more long-form documentary edit, or maybe it might come into the creative edit. Who knows? You never know when something crazy is going to happen that got a really good reaction. Or, singing waiters and musicians. People have booked people to perform at their weddings for a reason. So we might think, oh, well, we've seen a million bands, we've seen a million musicians at weddings, maybe even the same one. But the thing is, the couple have picked them for a reason. So why wouldn't they want to have some kind of way to hear some of that back? They might not even hear any of it. There might be someone performing for an hour at their wedding, and they might be so busy talking to everybody or doing stuff, they never got to hear even one song. So wouldn't it be nice to be able to give them a recording of that in a more long-form documentary way? But also, I've started to record some of this stuff, like a musician or whatever, performer, a band, just so that I've got it as an option. If it was really good and it really fit, then it might make the creative edit, whether it's just a little snippet or whether it's actually the full shebang. Like the whole song is made, a whole song is incorporated that the band or the musician played because it fits so well. And you never know when that's going to happen. So it's worth thinking about how you can record those things. And obviously the ceremony and speeches, we're going to want to record those as well as we can. And that's what we're going to be talking about in terms of how we go about that, and the practicalities of that now. So let's talk equipment. This is going to be probably the most interesting part for some people who are really into equipment and things. So the first thing we'll talk about is the types of microphone. And again, I'm no expert, so I'm just going to give you a very simple overview of this. But there are different types of microphone. So for instance, the one I'm speaking into right now for the podcast is a dynamic microphone. And that is a very sensitive and expensive microphone that basically will pick up a very specific pattern of voice. That's giving a very very simplified view of it, but that's the reason you use them for things like podcasting. Because if I move away from the microphone, it really kind of drops off, and I have to move really close to it. And by doing that, it also allows me to have quite a nice fuller sound. So that's why they use them for podcasting and radios and things like that. They do use it for other stuff like some music functions, but that'd be a dynamic microphone. And you would obviously use this potentially for like lots of things, but typically for weddings, we're going to use something called a condenser microphone, and that would be the type of microphone you find in most of the audio recorders and microphones that we use at weddings. Things like lav mics are condensers, and things like the Sony TX650s and stuff like that we use, they're all going to be condenser microphones. They're much more versatile, they're less sensitive. So, if you start like banging on it, or like, volumes are all over the place, it's not going to sound too bad. It's going to handle it much better. And then the third type is a ribbon one. We won't cover these because these are more like old-fashioned type microphones that are used like by singers and things back in the day, and they're still used now to get like vintage vocal recording sessions and things like that. Then the other thing to talk about when it comes to microphone is the pattern. So basically it's how it picks it up, right? And there are lots and lots of different types, but the main ones would be omnidirectional, so all around. There'd be bidirectional, so it's just going to pick it up at the front and the back and not the sides. Cardioid would, a cardioid microphone has more of like a polar pattern, so basically it's kind of going to get it round the front, and then as you go around the sides and the back, it drops off. So you get a different sound, if you like, to the microphone, and again, that's used in a lot of like singing stuff to like be able to move away from the microphone and things. And then you've got like things like XY patterns, which are for recording natural sounds, which you get in a lot of recorders that we'll use here, like a Zoom one, and you'll get like, for instance, the lav mic will be omnidirectional, so it's recording all around. And all of these different patterns will help you to record the audio in different ways. Now, you don't really need to know a lot of this. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background. What you need to know is that why you use certain microphones for certain situations, or why you use certain patterns for certain situations. And you don't need to worry about that so much, because if you just use one of the microphones that everybody uses for wedding filmmaking, you'll be getting it, you'll be in the right direction. But most people don't understand why they're using those microphones, and that's kind of a little bit of what I'm trying to explain. So I'm trying to give you a little bit of the why you use that particular microphone and why you use certain settings. So the other thing we need to think about when we're talking about audio recorders and microphones for wedding filmmaking is going to be storage. So practicalities, storage and battery. So we need to know that we've got enough storage, and we need to know that the battery is going to last us long enough. Now, there are different ways of handling that, and there are different devices that handle that. So there are internal batteries and internal storage, and then there are the devices that have SD cards, micro SD cards, and external batteries in them. And obviously, you need to understand that as part of purchasing this equipment and as part of running this equipment, that you've got enough storage and enough batteries to make sure that runs okay. So that will come into, when I talk about what we actually use, that will come into why we use what we use. And then the last consideration when it comes specifically to wedding filmmaking is we need to balance quality over convenience. So if we were recording in a perfect world, a studio, film set, whatever, we would just pick the best microphones for the job, and that would be it. There wouldn't be any other questions. But because we're recording a live event, and specifically because we're recording a wedding that happens very quick, sometimes, on most occasions we're working by ourselves, we have to just compromise sometimes over the quality in order to get the convenience. And we're working with people that aren't, they're not models and they're not actors, they're not people, they're not talent. They are, they're already feeling uneasy about being on camera, and now you're about to start talking about microphones and recording them. And in my experience, people being on camera is freaking them out. As soon as you tell them you're going to record the voice, that really, really, really freaks them out. So what I would say is that you want to be trying to put them at ease. So thinking about what equipment you're going to use is really important, because making them feel relaxed is actually as much the priority as it is to get really good audio. So again, compromises. So we'll start with the onboard mics that you get from your camera. So, we take, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see what I'm talking about on camera. Sorry, I'll try and describe it best I can for those listening. Up at the top here, you've got onboard mics. So in this corner, you can see those two little holes, and there will be potentially some others. And what we're getting there is a microphone in the camera that is recording the audio. And people used to say this, that they were really shit. The microphones that you get on cameras, they're not brilliant, but they're much better than what they used to be. That's for sure. On the newer Sony cameras, they're much better. I wouldn't use them to record my wedding ceremony and speeches, but what I'm saying is for like ambient stuff, for background noise, I think they're really good. And this is the reason I don't these days use something like, and I can't find one unfortunately, but excuse me, shotgun mic. So when I first started doing this, everybody used to put a Rode shotgun mic on top of the camera and plug it into the 3.5 mil jack. And what I would say is that at the time there wasn't as much variety in terms of on-person recorders. The price of those was much more expensive, and I do see the point in putting a shotgun mic on top of your camera. It will make a difference, but what I would say is it makes the most difference if you're a little bit closer to the subjects talking than what we are at weddings. Usually we're not near enough for it to really make a difference. And so a lot of the time to capture general ambient audio and things like that, if you think about through prep and through the rest of the day, and I'm not necessarily talking about ceremony speeches, but we won't put the shotgun mic on anymore. We'll just use the in-camera mics to capture the audio. And that's because we are focusing on using the audio that we're going to put on the people. That's what we're focusing on. We're not focusing on using the in-camera audio, and that's just there as an extreme backup. So, you've got your Rode Video Mic Pros and your Rode Video Micros and all these other different options, and they're brilliant, and I do recommend them for certain situations, and it's still worth having them if you have other audio sources, if they're not your primary, but I would never buy those over buying something that you can clip onto a person. And I'm going to go through those now. So the number one thing that we use would be the Sony TX650. Now, I think you can't get those. It's the TX660, which is the same thing. It's just an updated model. Or the Sony TX800. And the Sony TX800 is basically the same thing, but it's just a square version of it. And now the price of these has gone up. The TX650s or 660s have gone up. The 800 is actually a similar price. The 800 is brilliant because it's even smaller in a way, and it's kind of a square factor. So you put it on the person, and it's much better for clipping onto women's dresses and things like that because it doesn't kind of pull on them as much. So we use those like everybody else does, or most people do in the wedding filmmaking industry. And the reason is because of that situation I was talking about, where it's compromising convenience over quality. So the quality, I think, is good enough, and the convenience that you get with it makes it the best option in most cases. Not every single one, but most cases. And I will go through the kind of settings and things like that in a while. But what I would say is that those are the primary thing we use week in, week out. And whenever we try to use something else and we give it a trial, we always end up coming back to that because it just works. So a few other things, and bearing in mind we've bought these before we bought the TX650s, most of them. This is a Tascam DR10L. It's a recorder that's got a lavalier mic that plugs into it, clips onto someone's lapel of their jacket or whatever. These are great, right? And they were the kind of gold standard for a while until some of the newer things came out. But what I'd say is, when you've got a wire, you're always faffing around, and that's what puts me off. That's what means it's not as easy to convince someone to feel relaxed when you start trying to put something in their inside pocket or hide it somewhere else, and then run a wire and keep the wire from coming out of the jacket and then clip it onto the jacket. And it takes time. Even if it only takes 30 seconds to a minute, it takes time. Whereas you can go in straight with those TX650s and just bang it in their pocket, or clip it straight onto like a jacket or a waistcoat or something. And there are issues with doing it, I'm not going to lie, but most of the time they are the best way to go. Some other options, so we've got a Rode Wireless Go 2 kit here. So these are wireless, but they also record internally. That's the unit there. And these are great. You know, essentially they're the same size, a little bit bigger than the Sony TX800, but they're sending a wireless signal, and you can plug the receiver into the camera, and then you've got it recording in camera, and there's two of these, and it records internally to the device as well, like in its memory, so you've got like this really good file afterwards that you can use. And they are great, but I've just found them not to be as reliable, not to be as easy to use as something like the Sony TX650s and TX800s, and that's why we don't really use those as the primary. We use them for other things, but at weddings it would have to be, you know, I'd have to need more audio sources to call on those, if you like. And then we've got these. These are, I'm trying to think what you would class these as, field recorders, I guess. And that's the Zoom H4N and the Zoom H2N. And we've got a H4N as well, which used to be the thing that people used to plug the lavaliers into. But basically, these are there to record more of a ambient audio / backup. So we will place those at the front of the ceremony, and we'll on the top table of the speeches, and they will basically get us a backup recording that's closer than what the cameras would be. So again, you know, they're better typically than plugging a shotgun mic into the top of your camera, because they're closer to the source, but they're not the primary thing we're going to use. They are a backup, and they're also there to, you know, if there's a string quartet or a band or something like that, we set them up near there to record the music, and then we might use the music from those in the film later on. And that is pretty much it. Now, we do have now, there are newer options. These we haven't invested much money in audio for the last year or two, and we invested a lot of money in all our equipment, but the last year or two, these things have been working for us. But now we've got, you know, 32-bit float recorders like a Zoom F2, the Tentacle Track E, And there are more and more of these coming out all the time. And if we were investing in new equipment now, that's probably where we would go, because, and we're going to come on to this in a minute, but having that 32-bit float capability is useful at something like a wedding. You know, it's a peace of mind. If you're not really sure you've got your levels right, it's going to give you a lot more leeway to manipulate the audio. So it's worth mentioning those, because the stuff that we're using is a few years old now, but it's still works very well, and I would still recommend it to anyone. But if you were investing your money now, I'd probably be looking at, if you could get 32-bit float recorders and microphones, I would be looking at that. And like the last thing, well, there's two last things to mention. One would be, imagine someone springs a reading on you or opens a letter and you want to record it. Just grab your phone and turn the voice recorder on your phone, you know, the voice memos. Believe me, that's always going to get you better than what gets you in your camera. And the reason for this is, what you want the audio as close to the source as possible. If there's one thing that you take away from this entire podcast, it is that the audio recorder, the microphone, needs to be as close to the source as possible. That's the number one out of every experience I've ever had, every test I've ever done. It's the number one determiner, if you like. I don't even know if that's a word. It's the number one thing that's going to get you much better quality audio, is the closer you get it to the source, the better. So think about that when you're thinking about how to use audio. And that's the reason for, you know, using shotgun mics on cameras and things like that. Unless you're getting, you know, close enough, it's not going to make that much difference. The last thing to mention would be connecting the feed to the DJ booth. So imagine you've got a PA system, people are delivering speeches, things like that. This is a very American thing. It's not really done in this country so much, but there are plenty of in-house hotel or venue PA systems, and they will use the microphone. It'll come through the speakers. And I think that, you know, I can see the reason for connecting into a PA system and taking a feed out of it and recording it in your own device, so that you've got a recording of exactly what was going through the microphone. And in order to do that, you're going to need some cables. There are lots of different cables that you would potentially need, because standards are different at different PA systems. So some of the cables you might need might be XLR, RCA, TRS, lots of different sizes of actual connectors. So in order to be like ready for it all, you need to buy like a lot of different types of cables, and there are other bits of equipment as well that kind of convert signals or make them slightly less intense so that it doesn't mess up your equipment or your recording. But the reason I'm not getting into any of this, I'm not going to talk about it as an option that we do, is for a good reason. And that is because I've never found the reliability of an in-house, particularly in the UK, an in-house PA system to be useful. So, you know, we might strap a Sony TX650 to the microphone, using a Velcro straps or a elastic device, and we might record internally from what they're saying, holding the microphone in front of their face. But I've never seen a reason to take a feed, and the reason is because it's so unreliable. It drops out all the time. It usually isn't mixed, and the levels aren't correct, so it's coming through the speakers and it sounds distorted. So why would it not sound distorted in the recording from the feed? And you're basically relying on a third party. You're not able to just decide and do it yourself. You're having to rely on, you know, the venue, a DJ, whatever. I'd rather not have that stress. I'd rather be able to just decide myself how I'm going to record the audio. So that's That's basically why we've never recorded from a PA system or a DJ or anything like that. So let's talk about settings. This is the way that we're going to set up the recording. So we're using an audio recorder or a microphone, and what we're actually doing is we're capturing analog sound and we're making it into a digital file. And how we do that, the way that we set that digital recording up, that's going to impact on the file that we've got to use and work with later. So if you think about it, if you think about audio and recording audio as the equivalent of either recording a different types of raw file in photo versus different type of JPEG file in photo, or the type of codec that you would use with video. So, whether it's 4K, 10-bit, 422, or 8-bit HD, 420, all that sort of business. Basically, that's what we're talking about when it comes to the settings in audio. How we're going to record it is the codec. Now, there are a couple of things to just consider. The decibels, that is basically how intense the sound is. So your decibels are how loud it is, but also the intensity of the sound. So that's, if you ever hear decibels, that's what we're talking about. Dynamic range, just like in images, when we talk about dynamic range, we're talking about the difference between the highlights, the really bright areas, and the really dark areas. We're talking about the highest volumes and the lowest volumes. So when you talk about dynamic range in audio, it's pretty much the same as it is in visuals. And then distortion. So think of distortion, or you might hear the term clipping the audio or something like that. Think about it as blowing out the highlights on an image. If you blow the highlights out, you can't recover the highlights. So if it's too loud and it's distorted, or there's something else distorting that recording, it's because you've got the incorrect settings or something, you're not going to be able to recover it. So it's really important that you get the recording right. So what we don't want is the signal being too strong, and we don't want the signal being shit. So we don't want rubbing on it, and we don't want, there are things that you can do to try and reduce those things in post-production, but essentially, if you really mess the recording up, if it's really fucked up, you're not going to be able to do an awful lot with it. There are things that can be done, but it's going to get expensive. It's not something you're going to do yourself. It's not going to be worth it, sending it off for someone to clean up the audio on, a speech or whatever that you've recorded wrong when, you got paid a few £100 for doing this job. You've got to think about it, and so it's better to know this stuff and understand it and get it right. So, what could be the issues? What could be the issues causing that distortion? It could be that you've not got the levels right. It could be that you've not set the equipment up properly, so if something's not connected properly, and it's going to create a weird signal or distortion. So it's, think about rubbing, think about something being not connected properly, like the jack in the microphone, like it from the recorder to the lav microphone, not putting it in properly. So you've got to think about that. Now we'll get on to like specifics with the settings. So file type, you might have seen this before. So we've got WAV, we've got MP3, and then there are boatloads of other different formats. So this is, again, it's the same as like a codec, if you like. But essentially, what we want is we want an uncompressed format to record in, if possible. That won't be possible with every single type of microphone or /audio recorder. But if you think of an MP3 as a compressed file, so that's like a JPEG, and you think of WAV as a raw file in photo, what we're basically wanting is we're wanting all of the information there. So if there's the option to record in WAV, we want to record in WAV. And this might also be known as LPCM, which is basically the technical term is linear pulse code modulation. So that is pure audio. That is how you're recording pure audio in like that raw form. So we want LPCM or WAV rather than MP3 when we're recording audio. Okay, so the sample rate is about transforming an analog sound into a digital file. And it's about how many samples are taken every second. So what the kilohertz bit of this is saying is how many times per second we are sampling those sounds. And the more samples that you have, the more detailed the digital file. And there are different standards to this. But typically, what you're going to see in most of the recorders that we use is something like 44.1, 48, 96, 88, all these different numbers. Now, 44.1 is what you see quite regularly in a lot of the recorders we use, and that is standard CD quality. Obviously, we don't have CDs anymore, but CD became like a bit of a standard. So we have the CD quality. But you can have higher than that. So 48 kilohertz is quite a popular one. Something like 96 kilohertz is really high. Now, the higher, the better. As we'll go on to talk about now, higher basically means bigger files and stuff. I don't think that's as much of an issue these days. I think you want more information, but it used to be an issue, and so people used to be careful about how large they recorded files. I think that's kind of gone out the window these days with the size of video files that we're recording. So, that's that. The next thing is your bit rate and depth. So you've got 16-bit, 24-bit, 32-bit, 64-bit. When you say 32-bit flow, it basically means that's the bit rate and depth that you're using. 16-bit, that is, again, like your old-fashioned CD quality. So 24-bit is really good. If you're using 24-bit and 48 kilohertz sample rate, that's going to be a really high-quality file. But obviously, if you've got access to 32-bit and you've got access to 96 kilohertz, that's going to be an even better file. So we're going to use that if that's a realistic option. And what that means is it's the number of bits of information in each sample. In simple terms, it's, more information, bigger dynamic range, potentially there's less noise in the file. And what this leads to is a more, it makes it more precise for you to mix and manipulate that data, that sound. So imagine, you've got visual files and you are color grading and you're changing the exposure in your video. So you've recorded it, but you want to bump up the exposure and you want to tweak the colors and change the colors a little bit and give it a nice look. Whether that's in video or photo, it's going to, if you haven't recorded it, if you've recorded it in JPEG and you start trying to do all those things, the file will start to fall apart. You'll start to see a lot of noise in it. You'll start to see artifacts and things that shouldn't be there, and it will generally start to look a bit shit. And it's the same with audio. If the smaller the file, and when you start mixing it and manipulating it and trying to change it, it's going to fall apart. That's why you want as much data as possible. And these days, we have computers that we have much more hard drive space, and we have computers that are much more capable of working with these files. So I don't think it's as big a deal. And if you take something, like Final Cut Pro that we use to edit the videos, that's working on the Mac, it's basically, if you put all these different files in there at different bit rates and depths, and it basically will convert them all so that they're all on an even keel, so that they're all the same, and then you can edit them no problem. If you didn't have that, you might end up with, if you had all these different types of files, you might end up with some being a little bit faster or slower than others. You would definitely notice a difference when you start to edit them and you started to like change and mix them, because you'd notice the difference in qualities. But the great thing about modern recording devices and modern software is it handles it really well. Right. Before we finish, what settings do we recommend? So what we record most stuff in is at 24-bit and either 44.1 kilohertz or 48 kilohertz. We'll do it in WAV or LPCM. And when we're setting the recording up, we'll set it for around -12 to -6 decibels. And what we want is, we want to clap and we want to make a loud noise like a sing or a shout into the microphone, to make sure that when we do that, it doesn't go over that -6 decibels, because we're trying to keep it under 0. So we don't want it peaking above that. In a Sony TX650, what that looks like is setting it to the LCPM mode and putting it on low. And we find that does a really good job in the Sony TX650. With the Tascam DR10L, again, you can change some of these settings manually, but we put it 24-bit and 48, and we set a lower safety channel, but we put it on high in terms of the gain. And then we turn the auto level off, put the limiter on, and turn the low cut off. And we tend to find that gets us a really good file to work with. And then like the zooms, the field recorder style devices, we just put them in 24-bit, and we either have them at 48 or 96 kilohertz. And that gets us, again, a good file to work with. So, last minute considerations, techniques for recording to get the best quality. What you got to do is you got to think about that mic distance. You don't want a microphone too close to somebody's mouth when we're talking like this. And we want to be careful of pops and sibilances, air coming out of your mouth, the position of the mic. So pop, pop, pop. I've got multiple pop filters and stuff on here, and it still is an issue. Now, think about when you're putting a microphone on somebody around their kind of neck, chest area. You've got to think about where you're putting it and where the air is going to come out of the mouth. So you don't want it to be in a position where it's going to be catching them going all the time. You can't really help it, but if you think about it, if you put it to one side rather than right in the middle, you've got less chance of that happening. So that's like a consideration. Should you mic women? Should you mic a bride who's wearing a wedding dress? Personally, we don't mic the bride. We've never mic'd the bride. I can see a reason for it. I can see the theory behind it. It's just the way we work is about no stress. And to me, that is actually asking to create stress. So, no, we won't do that. Sometimes you can mic a woman if they're wearing an appropriate outfit where the mic will work. And that's where the Sony TX800s come into it, because they're square and they're really kind of, the weight is distributed nicely with them. They don't tug on people's dresses and blouses and things like that. So they're really good for using on miking women who are wearing dresses. And sometimes we'll just get them to hold them in their hand or clip them to the piece of card or book or whatever that they're reading from, and that works really well. So that's kind of how we get around that. Location for subject. So where is someone going to stand? Where are you going to position them? Well, let's be honest. It's a live event. It's a wedding. We're not able to do that. But there are times where if someone's going to read something like a letter, they're going to open a gift, that type of thing, you can think about listening out. If there's an air conditioner, if there's a fan, if there's some TV or music on, you can think about turning that off. And that is, that's really helpful to using that audio later if you think about those things in advance. But for most of the time, we can't really manipulate, where the subject is going to be, particularly ceremony speeches. We just have to work with what we've got. And therefore, when we're considering unwanted noises, we're obviously going to stop and remove unwanted noises that we can, like a radio or a TV or, a fan or something, if it's in a room that where they're just getting ready. But we can't do that in the middle of a ceremony or speeches, etc. Think about background noises. If there is a fan in a room, it's really good to record it in advance with nobody in, nothing happening. And by recording that noise, you will get something that you can use later on to help you remove that noise in post-production. That's just something to think about. Maybe you've never had that situation, maybe you never thought about it. But if you record a fan in a room and then you've got that noise, you can use that recording to then help you remove the frequency of the noise of that fan during the ceremony when people are talking. So that's something to think about. And then we also want to never rely on one source of audio for, particular things like ceremony and speeches. So we always want to have more than one recorder that could give us the audio. And whether you're using in-camera, shotgun mic in camera, whether you're using like an external recorder like a Zoom, or you've got multiple recorders clipped to somebody, you'd never want to be just thinking, that's all I've got. And there are times where that happens. There's times when that's happened to us. We've only, it's been a rush, it's been last minute, and we've had one mic. And we were relying on that, but you don't want to do that as a routine. Okay, so a lot of information there, because audio is a huge topic in itself. It's as huge as how do you take pictures or get video clips. It's as important as those things. So I've rushed through it. I haven't even spoken in detail about a lot of it, but I hope it's been useful in some way for you to, if you are a filmmaker, a videographer, I hope that it's helped kind of, if you've got experience in this, I hope it's helped kind of bring all that together for you, maybe remind you, or, just know that, yeah, you kind of do it like that too. And if you're new to this, hopefully it's helped give you some tips on how to go about things. And if you're a photographer and you've got no interest in video whatsoever and you have listened to this, hopefully it's given you an insight into the sort of, the shit that we're having to think about to record audio at a wedding, and why it's probably the main reason we can't just run around following the couple. We have to be like, right, but we have to set the audio up. We have to get the audio back off people. It's the thing that slows you down the most, I would say, at a wedding. When the photographer's off and taking them, going after the couple, just got married, taking pictures of them. And if you're working solo, it's probably one of the things, other than the static cameras that you've got set up, but you've got to go sort the audio out and make sure you've recovered all the microphones and everything from people, and it can be a real challenge. And there is no simple way to do it. It is what it is. and you kind of work out a way of doing it, but it means you have to sacrifice certain bits of the day to be able to record that audio well. So I hope it's been helpful. It's not one of those sexy topics. It's quite technical. But again, like I said at the start, I wish someone had explained it to us earlier on so that we understood it in a more kind of simple but also a more technical way, so that it wasn't like, oh, we'll try this and we'll try that. If I had to give you one thing of advice, it would be, use whatever it is that works for you. The Sony TX650s / 660s or 800s or whatever, they work great for us. But I've got other stuff in case we come to a situation and you need to do it different. And it's in the bag. I've got it in the bag and I pull it out and I just clip it on. But it's about knowing what's going to work best in certain situations. If it's been helpful, let us know. If you've got any remarks, if you've got any feedback, if you've got any opinions on what we've been talking about, please drop us a DM at Wedding Mavericks on Instagram or Facebook. And we've got the website. There's the YouTube channel if you want to watch me having this conversation. And thank you very much for listening. Hope you tune in again to the next one and have a great week. See you next time.